Welcome to Gramercy Books Author Night, featuring two masters of the narrative nonfiction form in a conversation about memoir. Award-winning writer Lee Martin's latest memoir, Gone the Hard Road, will be the catalyst for this discussion with acclaimed creative nonfiction scholar and author Dinty W. Moore about Lee's book. Gone the Hard Road was recently released by Indiana University Press. I want to thank Ohio State University's Creative Writing Program, Gramercy's community partner for tonight's program. I'm Linda Cass. We're live streaming this program through Zoom webinar, and it will be recorded. Let me preview the next hour or so for you. After introductions, Lee and Dinty will talk for about 35 to 40 minutes. That will be followed by 15 to 20 minutes for your questions, and they will be submitted in the Q&A box. You'll find that icon on the bottom of your screen if you're using a desk or laptop. This is where Dinty will be taking your questions for Lee during that latter portion of the program. You can write your questions into this box at any time. Those questions liked by many others will be upvoted, which means they'll rise to the top of the Q&A box, most likely to be asked. Another tool I'm sure many of you are familiar with is the chat box. This allows you to chat among yourselves, but it will not be monitored by the panelists. That icon also is on the bottom of your desk or laptop screen or at the top of other mobile devices. We hope your chats don't distract you from what will be an intriguing conversation tonight. I do want to draw your attention for a moment to the chat box, so do click onto that icon now. It will open a column on the right of your screen. We've placed registration links for several upcoming live stream programs hosted by Gramercy Books. On Tuesday, June 15th at 7 p.m., a not to be missed visit with produce guru Farmer Lee Jones, author of a gorgeous, soulful cookbook, The Chef's Garden, a modern guide to common and unusual vegetables. Farmer Lee will be in conversation with American ice cream maker, entrepreneur, and author Jenny Britton Bauer. On Tuesday, June 22nd, and this one will be at 6 p.m. because the author is coming from London. It will be in London. We're going to feature prize-winning biographer Anne Seba's latest book, Ethel Rosenberg, An American Tragedy, whose espionage-related crimes defined the Cold War and horrified the world. Anne will be in conversation with noted Ohio State historian and author David Steigerwald. And on Wednesday, June 30th at 7 p.m., we'll have our first hybrid program. That's hybrid, meaning in-store and on Zoom, as we feature two local writers in conversation about crime fiction, and specifically the latest mystery from writer Andrew Welsh Huggins called An Empty Grave. Andrew will be interviewed by fellow Buckeye Crime Writers member Connie Berry. So we encourage you to click on the link for any of these programs to learn more about them, as well as to register if you'd like. You can sign up on our website, gramercybooksbexley.com, to receive our e-newsletter, and you can learn all about Gramercy's live streamed, hybrid, and soon to be live programs. And now on to tonight's program. A haunting and hypnotic memoir by one of our finest storytellers, Lee Martin's Gone the Hard Road, is the story of Beulah Martin's endurance and sacrifice as a mother and the gift of imagination she offered her son. Gone the Hard Road offers the counter-narrative to Lee's previous memoirs about his father, here of a loving mother and the creative life she made possible despite the eventual cost to herself. Lee Martin's fiction and nonfiction have appeared in such places as Harper's, Creative Nonfiction, and The Best American Essays, and he is the author of many novels, including The Bride Forever, which was a finalist for the 2006 Pulitzer Prize in Fiction, as well as Yours, Jean, The Mutual UFO Network, and Late One Night, among others. Lee is the winner of the Mary McCarthy Prize in Short Fiction, the 2006 Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching from The Ohio State University, and he's received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Ohio Arts Council. He teaches in the MFA program at The Ohio State University, where he is a College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor. Lee, it is a thrill to welcome you back to Gramercy Books tonight and for us to share your extraordinary memoir with our Central Ohio community.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thanks so much for having me tonight.
And in conversation with Lee is Dinty W. Moore. Dinty is Professor Emeritus in Ohio University's English Department, which he joined in 2007, leading its creative writing program from 2008 until 2020. His recent memoir, To Hell With It, Of Sin and Sex, Chicken Wings, and Dante's Entirely Ridiculous Inferno, is his personal and jesting reflection on religion's influence on culture and society. His other books include the memoir Between Panic and Desire, which was winner of the Grub Street Nonfiction Book Prize in 2009. Also, The Mindful Writer, The Accidental Buddhist, The Emperor's Virtual Clothes, and the writing guide, Crafting the Personal Essay, a guide for writing and publishing creative nonfiction. He also wrote the craft anthology, The Rose Medal Press Guide to Writing Flash Nonfiction. Dinty has published essays and stories in numerous journals and publications, from the Southern Review to the New York Times Sunday Magazine. He is the editor of Brevity, the Journal of Concise Literary Nonfiction, and is the co-editor of the anthology, The Best of Brevity, 20 Groundbreaking Years of Flash Nonfiction. Dinty, welcome to Gramercy Books, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Linda. It's great to be here. It's especially great to be here to celebrate a writer like Lee Martin, who's hit another one out of the park.
Well, thanks to all of you in our audience for joining us this evening. We're thrilled to have Lee Martin in conversation with Dinty Moore.
So Lee, I wondered if you'd consider reading a little bit from the book, just to give the listeners a flavor of the prose you write, which is just so brilliant and clear and evocative. And then we'll talk.
I'd be glad
with you.
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that, Dinty. And thank you so much for being here to chat with us tonight. Just to set this very, very brief reading up, for those of you who don't know, I grew up in a very rural part of southeastern Illinois. My father owned an 80-acre farm in Lawrence County, Illinois. Much of my early life was spent on the gravel roads of this small farming locale. And whenever we had to do our grocery shopping, we would go to the largest town, which was 1,000 people, tiny Sumner, Illinois. But to get there, we would have to go up on what we called, well, it was a paved road, and we called it either the blacktop, the slab, or the hard road. And so that's where the title of the memoir comes from, Gone the Hard Road, because if we were on the hard road, we could be going anywhere we wanted to go. The other thing you need to know is that my father lost both of his hands in a farming accident when I was barely a year old. And I was a surprise baby, never meant to come along. My mother was 45 when I was born, and my father was 42. And with that, I'll give you just a brief section from the opening of Gone the Hard Road. After my father was dead, my mother told me the story of the day they learned she was pregnant. They got the news in Doc Stoll's office, and the first thing my father said to the good doctor was, "Can you get rid of it?" I've written about this moment before, the moment when my father, concerned for my mother's health at that advanced age for childbearing, asked Doc Stoll if he could perform an abortion. I imagine that question hanging in the air of the office, my father waiting for Doc Stoll's response. I keep thinking about those few seconds when it was possible that Doc Stoll might say yes, and then I wouldn't exist. Wouldn't have been the son of Roy and Beulah Martin from Route 1, Sumner, Illinois. Wouldn't have had the 64 years I've now had to know pleasure and joy and injury and suffering. Wouldn't have had this life. I can't get the thought out of my head that there were those few seconds when it was possible that my parents would have been rid of me. But Doc Stoll said no. No, indeed, he couldn't do that. This baby, I imagine him saying in his gruff voice, will get born and you'll just have to deal with that. No matter how far I've come from the country kid I was, I can never forget the family we were. My kind mother who loved books, my wounded father whose intense love often got swallowed up inside his rage, and me, the only child, eager to escape my life and to immerse myself in someone else's story. Whenever we drove the hard road, I often found myself imagining all the places that lay beyond it and wondering if given the chance, I might someday see them, might move beyond those gravel roads, might leave behind me the dust and the fields, might finally know exactly where I belonged. I fell in love with books and the life of the imagination at an early age. And because of that, the world opened to me. I can still see myself sitting beside my mother in Doc Stoll's waiting room, a Highlights for Children magazine open between us. She holds one side of it, I hold the other. Some of my fondest memories from childhood are the times we spent alone together, safely away from my father's temper. She helps me with the words I don't know. We do the puzzles. We find the hidden pictures, and we read the jokes. Sometimes she reads a story to me. Her voice is soft, and I want to listen to it forever. I like to think she believes her life has turned out exactly how she always wanted it to be. Always wanted to be a mother. Always wanted me, her son, and was glad that day when Doc Stoll said no, he couldn't get rid of it. This baby would have to be born. Read another one, I say, when she finishes a story. And she does, my kind and patient mother. I can still hear her. All right, she says. Then she turns the page and we begin.
That's absolutely lovely, Lee.
Thank you.
So we both teach and work with a lot of writers who are trying to write memoir. And speaking for myself, I spent a lot of time trying to nail down what makes a memoir work. And I know over the years I've determined that the mistake a lot of writers make is, the thrust of the memoir is, well, this happened to me. Whereas, the more I think about memoir and read memoir, I realize that the thrust of a good memoir is, how did it turn out this way? And how might it have turned out otherwise? And, you've just taught us a masterclass with that brief introduction about, how might it have turned out otherwise if Dr. Stoll had said this or that, or agreed to this or that? How might it have turned out otherwise if your mother had had that love for reading? It's a beautiful passage you read us, but it's also, I think, very instructive about how memoir works, the wondering and imagining how we got here and how the various turns onto the hard road or the soft road led us in the direction we ended up. There's a lot of questions in your opening there.
Well, that's really interesting that you point that out, Dinty, because don't you find that when you're writing memoir, even though you're telling a story, you're doing that to investigate something that you don't quite know. You're looking into something, like you say in this case, it's that question of how did we end up here, right? What would have happened if Doc Stoll had said, well, sure, I can do that? Or what would have happened?
Would have been a very short book.
It would have been a very, very short book indeed. But yeah, I agree with you that I think that often people are interested in telling their own stories and less interested in sort of investigating those stories, trying to figure something out. I always say that I write from a position of not knowing something.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the fuel of good writing. I mean, I always like to talk about how it's not that different on the page than it is in real life. If you're sitting in a coffee shop or a bar, let's imagine, well, we're getting back to that now post-COVID. You're sitting in a coffee shop or a bar and some guy comes up to you and says, hey, here's my life. Let me tell you all about it and what it means. You get pretty bored pretty fast. But if somebody sits next to you and says, help me figure this out, then you're going to sit there and listen and talk to that person. And I think that's, what we're talking about here with memoir.
I think that's the difference right there, Dinty, in the difference between just narrating a story and really investigating a story. You're so right. The guy who sits down next to you on the bus and says, let me tell you this story, that puts you on the periphery of the story, right? But if that guy says, the darndest thing happened to me and I can't figure it out, maybe you can help me, then that makes you a fellow traveler with that person. And that's what I think we're looking for in memoir. We want to feel as if we are traveling with a narrator who is just as mystified as we are. And together we're trying to figure out this experience.
Yeah, because we are.
Yeah,
You are, I am, and I think everybody listening tonight, and everybody I know, life is, I don't believe there are easy answers in life. It's a confusing thing, and that's pretty exciting some days, not every day.
Well,
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think that's why memoirists can traverse the same terrain more than once, because, as you say, the answers are never definitive, right? There's always a different angle to look at experience, and to see what that has to show you that you haven't seen yet.
Well, can you talk more about that? Because that was on my list of things I wanted to hit tonight, is the fact that you've been over this territory before. I've read your earlier books, focusing more on your father and the farm, and some of the violence. And this is the same characters show up. You're still the narrator. You're still a boy in Southern Illinois, but yet it's a very fresh book. And I know, I suspect we have other writers on the call here in the audience. How do you take a life, or in this case, your childhood, and find different ways to package it into entirely different books that still seem fresh and complete?
Well, I hope it seems fresh, because
it did to me.
It's always a concern, right, when you're dealing with material that you've dealt with before. But I think, what I tried to do with this book, first of all, it started with my memory of that magazine, Highlights for Children. And I often talk to my own students about starting with something kind of low stakes, right? So, we open with the memory of that magazine, but then that takes me to Doc Stoll's office, which then takes me to the story that my mother told me after my father was dead, which then just kind of opens up this whole question of how did I become who I became and what was my mother's role in it. The other thing I think is important is to find a slightly different perspective upon the material that you've dealt with before. So for example, in one section of the book called The Healing Line, I take the vantage point of my my paternal grandmother, and I think about what my father's accident was like for her, and that's a slightly new way of looking at material that I've covered before. I do the same thing by taking my mother's perspective in quite a few places in the book. So that's the way I go at it. Is I try to find a slightly different perspective or a different angle from which to look at the material.
Yeah, that's another I think aspect of memoir that sometimes people don't realize is the role of imagination. I mean, you're also a very accomplished and talented novelist, but people think, not a memoir is just the facts, man.
Mm.
And I'm pretty strict about telling the truth, but speculating about what that might have felt like to your paternal grandmother, as long as the reader's clear that it's you speculating, it's not the truth. You can't read her mind. You weren't alive, or you were just born. Excuse me. You were 1 year old. But that, you know, there's a lot of imagination in your book because you try to inhabit the other people, the characters who just happen to be real living people.
And you know, when a memoirist does that, uses the imagination to try to speculate on what the experience might have been like for someone else, actually the memoirist is revealing more of him or herself, because we're making that decision to imagine it this way or this way or this way. So it's sort of reflecting back and revealing more of the narrator's own character.
And one thing I love, well, really all of the characters in the book, the main characters, but certainly your father, you capture the contradiction in him. He's well, you've written about him before, and this is true every time you bring your father to the page. He's a very tender man. He's a very torn apart man, literally and emotionally, and he's got a lot of anger in him. But do you have a technique, or you just do your best to get the contradictions to make him seem so multifaceted, which I assume is truth? You know,
Yeah.
I mean, we all are very contradictory.
It's absolutely true. And I think as far as a technique, it's just a matter of looking very, very closely at some of the smallest of actions or smallest of behaviors. There's one part in the book where I'm in high school, and one winter night, the back door opens and an intruder comes into our house. It's a young boy who has a hand that's been cut badly. And my mother is in the kitchen, and my father and I are in the dining room. And at a certain point, my father becomes angry with the young man, and he turns and runs and leaves the house. And then my father is locking the doors, and there are those door handles with the little tabs in the middle that you turn to lock or unlock. And he's got, you know, the hooks, as he calls them, the prostheses. And it's hard for him to do that. He has to really work at doing that. And as he's doing it, he's saying, you know, he won't bother us anymore. And, you know, if I look at that moment really, really closely, what I see now that I couldn't see then was that he was so wounded that the only way he could speak of love or express love was through bluster, through anger. And so that's something that I certainly couldn't have seen or articulated at the time. So it's a matter of just taking a moment and looking at it closely enough to see more fully what's there. And that's the way I think that you go about finding the contradictory layers of character.
So I'm going to ask you a question, and if you say yes, I'm going to throw my camera across the room and end the Zoom call. So this is your first draft, right?
No, no, absolutely not. I'm glad I could save your camera. I really am. No, I mean, you know, books like this go through a lot of drafts, right? And individual sections of the book. And some of these were published as individual essays. The one I just described, for example, was an essay in the Georgia Review, and then later Best American Essays. And that went through a number of drafts before it was ever published anywhere. And then even after I started putting the book together, you know, there was a lot of work to be done with making a cohesive narrative for the book. Because as I said, a number of these pieces had seen life other places. And so I turned it into a memoir by finding that narrative arc that would connect everything. You just posted a quote was it by James Michener, who said he wasn't
I'm not a very good writer, but I'm an excellent rewriter.
Rewriter, yeah. And that's true for all of us, I think, right?
Yeah. I've met a few writers who I think they move. I don't know if they're telling the truth or they write so slowly that they do get it.
Yeah.
right the first time, but that makes no sense to me.
Yes.
I need to go through many
Yeah.
mistakes before I find, any sort of form for what I'm writing.
Right. Yeah, I'm the same way. Yeah, I envy those people who can do that if they're telling us the truth.
We're both suspicious.
Yeah.
Being an only child, well, you were not just an only child, you were an only child of relatively older parents. They were in their 40s when you were born. Do you think that had an influence on, well, it certainly had an influence on the story because you talk about it in the book. But well, why don't you, I'm not even going to ask a question. I'll just ask you to reflect on
Sure.
how being an only child changed things.
Well, I think, being an only child had a lot to do with me becoming a writer, because being an only child, particularly in a rural area where other children were at farms at some distance, there were days and days and days when I had to rely upon my imagination for entertainment when I was a kid. And the other thing that I think became really important to me was the fact that my father was a storyteller. And because I was the only child of older parents, whenever we would visit family members or friends, I would be the only kid there. And so usually I was sitting around on front porches or in kitchens or somewhere listening to people tell stories. So that became really important. But I think the other thing it did was, I think it started to require me to be very observant. Um, after I well, when I was going from the second grade to the third grade, my mother took a teaching position in Oak Forest, Illinois, a southern suburb of Chicago. And so I went from this two-room school in southeastern Illinois to this huge elementary school in suburban Chicago. And we spent the school year there, but we spent the summers back downstate on our farm. And so I was always sort of not fitting in either place because I wasn't there for the complete year, or I was the city kid now coming back to the farm. And as a result of that, I started paying very, very close attention to everything around me, trying to do everything I could to fit in, right? And so that kind of being caught between two cultures, I think also contributed a lot to the fact that I became a writer. I mean, I was always fascinated with words because my mother was such a avid reader, and I knew I wanted to do something with language after I figured out that center field for the Yankees was already taken by Mickey Mantle. So I wanted to do something with language, and then eventually I thought at one point I was going to be a journalist, but then I realized that meant I would have to talk to people, and I didn't really want to talk to people. So I preferred to stay in my room and talk to the characters I was putting on the page. And so that's when I started to really focus upon being a fiction writer at first. And then I just kind of accidentally became a memoirist.
I'm glad. So we're about the same age. I think I'm slightly older, but we grew up in the 60s and 70s. We have Highlights magazine in common, but a lot of the other things that come out in your book, whether it's everybody in high school experimenting with marijuana or other aspects of popular culture, sort of overlap. I noticed, I read a lot of stuff where I said, oh yeah, I remember that too, even though I grew up in a city in Pennsylvania. Do you think the 60s and 70s, if there's any, I hope there's a few young people in the audience, 60s and 70s had the Vietnam War, it had 2 Kennedy assassinations, the Martin Luther King assassination, the Vietnam War protests, which were almost as had almost as much impact as the war, at least on those of us back home. Do you think that, I don't know, do you think that changed who we are, people of our generation?
Well, it also had Woodstock, it had the moon landing. There were lots of things happening, right?
Yeah.
But in my little part of southeastern Illinois, in this little town of 1,000 people, it seems like we were slower to reach certain cultural positions than say you were in a larger city. Um, I don't know. I think I remember growing up surrounded by Vietnam, which was a huge concern for me because I was getting really close to the age of being eligible for the draft. And just everything connected to protesting that war, the civil rights movement, et cetera, et cetera. I think it did have an effect upon me as far as being a questioner, right? Not being afraid
Yeah.
to question what people were believing or telling me to believe. Yeah, so I do think that those kind of cultural events did have a huge effect upon me being one who was willing to question the prevailing opinions around me.
Yeah. I want to remind people that the Q&A box is down at the bottom of the screen for most of you. If you're on a phone or another device, you might have to search for it, but the Q&A box is the place to put questions that we're going to ask Lee in about another 5 minutes or so. I'll turn to the audience questions, but please put them up now so we have them ready. And then religion is another theme that at least your mother's wishes about, your mother's strength of Christian belief and her hope for you to embrace those Christian beliefs. How does that factor in for you in the story you're telling?
Well, first of all, I have to say that that was one area that I disappointed my mother in. I never could quite live up to that kind of Christian ideal that she wished for me. But the thing I always admired about my mother was that she was never evangelical about her spiritual beliefs. They were very personal and very private to her. And she modeled a way of living that became important for me. And even though I have fallen short of her ideals many, 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 many times, they are always there. And the one thing I wish that she could know, now that she's been gone so many years, is that things like reading the Dale Evans prayer book to me when I was a kid, it had an effect. It paid off. Even though I'm not the Christian sort she would want me to be, I believe I'm a spiritual person in the way that she was a spiritual person.
You're a kind man. I know that personally, but also spoken to enough people who've worked with you. So if kindness is the purpose here, I think she'd be very proud of you.
Well, I try.
Yeah, I don't know if she would have read the books. But she loved books.
I don't know if I would have written the books
Yeah.
had they still been alive.
I'm going to turn to the questions because we do have a few rolling in now, and I'm glad. And Sarah asks, Lee mentioned starting a memoir with something that is low stakes. If the first 5 pages are one of the most critical pages in a memoir, how can you start slow but carry the reader?
That's a really great question, Sarah. And I think it's like I was saying, instead of trying to jump in and say, okay, I'm writing a book about my mother's religious beliefs or whatever the case might be, something large and kind of sprawling like that. You might start out by recalling the cough drops that your mother always had in her purse when she was in church, and how she would take one out and then put it in her mouth, and then very quickly let that take you into the question that you have about your mother's faith in the example I'm using right now. So I guess what I'm trying to say is play this little trick on yourself by saying, I'm not writing about my mother's religious beliefs. I'm writing about these Hall's cough drops, right? And then just let them very quickly take you into the larger questions that you want to chase after.
That's so true. And you've written a craft book of writing advice, storytelling advice, and I know you blog regularly, I guess on Mondays. short lessons on writing, and you very often return us to objects. You know, the meaning is found in tangible things you can hold in our hand or lean against like a wall. So much more than in the ideas, and I love that question, and I love the idea of the cough drops, and you do that a lot, and poets know that.
Yeah,
I think prose writers need to be reminded that even though we have so many words, we can go on and on and on with our ideas. It's the cough drops or the highlights magazine or the our mother's purse that's going to open up the story more so than the ideas that we tell.
There's a beautiful poem by Miller Williams called "Let Me Tell You," and the first line is, "Let me tell you how to do it from the beginning. First, remember everything." And then he has a litany of very concrete details, objects, etc. And that's where writing really begins. And
did you study with Miller Williams? I know you were in Arkansas.
I did. Yeah. He always called it the furniture of the world. And I believe in using that furniture.
Yeah. Sue wants to know if there's a piece you wrote that resonated with other people in a way that surprised you and influenced how you went on to write. So was there something early on that you wrote and you said, oh my goodness, I got a reaction? And did that shape your future books or your future projects or just how you think about things?
Yeah, well, actually, Sue, thank you so much for that question. I remember when I first started to write memoir, I had my first tenure track teaching position, and they assigned me a graduate workshop in creative nonfiction. And I thought, wow, if I'm going to teach somebody how to write this, I better try to write some of it myself. So for the very first time, I wrote an essay that directly examined my father's accident and its effect upon our family. And it was a little essay called "From Our House." And it got picked up by a literary journal called Crab Orchard Review at Southern Illinois University. And next thing I knew, I'd written other essays about this same experience. And one of them was published in The Sun, this wonderful magazine from North Carolina. And I got a lot of response to that. And that would be, one of the early pieces that kind of told me, hey, maybe there's something here that other people are interested in reading about.
Billy Kilgore, who I like to imagine is actually Billy Pilgrim and Kilgore Trout, and actually Kurt Vonnegut speaking to us from the ether, but it might not be. It might be somebody out there named Billy Kilgore. Hi, Billy. He wants to know who the memoirists are that inspired you back in Arkansas in your first teaching job. That was in Arkansas, but when you first were assigned the class and decided to write memoir, were there memoirists? I know it wasn't as popular a form back then, but were there memoirists who influenced you or inspired you to try?
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, Billy is a real person. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting him yet, only online, but I'm glad, Billy, you're able to be here tonight. The first memoir that just took me by the throat and said, wow, you mean it's possible to do this, was Tobias Wolff's This Boy's Life. And I remember, Dinty, it was before the book came out, so it was probably mid-'80s. I was down in Athens at the time, and Tobias Wolff was at the Spring Literary Festival, and he read the opening chapter from the manuscript, This Boy's Life. And Andre Dubus was another visiting writer that year. And I remember distinctly that when Wolff finished reading, he came down from the dais, I guess, there in that little chapel, and Andre Dubus came rushing up the aisle and wrapped him up in his arms in this big bear hug. And it was a tremendous moment. And that book, This Boy's Life, is really what made me want to write memoir.
Yeah, that's an amazing book.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, he's an amazing writer and a generous person as well. I by the way, for the people who are watching and wondering why I have nothing on the walls, though I taught at Ohio University, as we were just talking about, for years and years and years and years. I moved to Philadelphia about 3 days ago and have no furniture and no pictures. And I'm sitting on a lawn chair, but I'm happy to be here. Pat wonders, how do your recollections of childhood change in the perspective of being a person your age now looking back? Or in other words, what benefit does age give in insight or recollection?
Pat, I think that age gives us perspective. I really do. The older I get, it does influence the way I look back upon certain experience, certain moments. I think I'm better able to see some of the ironies, levels of irony. For example, in the book, there's a moment where my mother and father have gone to a basketball game and I'm not able to go because I have a cold. I have to stay home with my grandmother. And I tell my mother I want her to bring me a kite because I've been to these basketball games and I've seen them selling these styrofoam boat-like things. And for some reason that I don't know, I have it in my head that that is called a kite. And so that's what my mother brings me. And I am upset because I wanted a kite. And she says, but that is a kite, but this is a kite, because she brought me a literal kite that I could fly. And I said, no, I wanted a kite. And so writing about that from an advanced age, I see the irony, the verbal ironies of that. So yeah, I think it just changes your perspective.
Yeah. Shauna asks, could you explain how I'll get to the question. You talked earlier, about 20 minutes ago, about how some of the chapters of what ended up being Gone the Hard Road were published in the Georgia Review and other places, and you brought them together and wrote new chapters. And you said that one of the challenges was finding sort of a continuous narrative thread. So Shauna's asking, how do you discover that narrative thread? How you're sitting down and thinking, okay, I've got these disparate pieces and this is going to be a book now, so it's got to have this narrative thread that carries from beginning to end. Can you explain the mystery of how you discover that?
I can try, Shauna. Thank you so much for the question. I think it differs from book to book. My first memoir, From Our House, I got lucky. It had a sort of geographical narrative arc. The opening taking place on our farm, the middle section taking place after we'd moved to Oak Forest, Illinois, and the closure of the book taking place when we had moved back downstate. With this book, I think it was more a matter of finding the narrative that would best express the story of my mother, particularly the story of the life she made possible for me, which means, Shauna and everyone else out there, that I didn't know how to do it until I got to the end of the first draft, right? Because I had to know where I was going to land before I could figure out how to provide the narrative tissue to get us there. So sometimes I think we have to write a lot before we find the shape that's going to allow us to best express what we've come to the page to express.
Yeah, and I think it's tempting to be impatient and try to impose something onto the page. And in my experience, at least, that doesn't work. It has to sort of bubble up organically.
It's got to be an organic structure, no doubt.
Or, when I was a fiction writer, when I wrote a lot of fiction, I do a little bit of fiction now, but I also got my MFA in fiction writing at LSU. When I was really focused on fiction writing, there was that magical moment that there was never enough of, where you're 4 or 5 drafts into a story and your characters start speaking to you, literally suggesting what might happen next, or blurting out some dialogue that, I'm typing and I'm going, oh my God, I can't believe Joe just said that, because suddenly Joe's real and alive.
It
It took me a while to get that experience in memoir, but it's what you're talking about. It's like when the book tells you, or the essay tells you where it wants to go and what it wants to be about. You know, people say, people say, what are you working on? I say a new project. They say, what's it about? And I'm like, I don't know.
Who knows, right?
It's the cough drops in my mother's purse.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of what Alice Walker said about the importance of silence for the writer, to just sit in silence until your characters start telling you where they want this book to, or this piece to go. And that's indeed what happens sometimes.
Kathleen and many of us want to know how we handle failure of memory, excuse me, as a memoirist. I mean, there's things we remember vividly, and then there's large stretches that we don't remember. How do you, or you know, do you have a perfect memory? Do you struggle with that? How do you meet the challenge of these memory gaps that we all seem to have?
A lot of daydreaming. Daydreams can, if you allow yourself to fall into that kind of river of daydreaming, all sorts of things get retrieved that you thought you had forgotten. Also just using artifacts, the artifacts that you do have, photographs, letters, whatever was left behind by your ancestors, just handling those things can sometimes bring back memories that may be really buried down deep inside you. I do think I have really good recall. I've been blessed with that for whatever reason. But when I don't remember something, maybe that's an invitation to use the imagination.
Yeah, yeah.
As you say, making it clear to the reader that that's what you're doing, and then when you do that, to press yourself by saying, why am I doing that? Why am I choosing to imagine? Is it because I want to trick myself into making the story come out a certain way? Is it because I want to have a little bit better understanding of another person? I mean, there could be a number of different reasons for doing it, but I think sometimes we play that card of imagination, and we don't press ourselves on why we're doing that.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the things we don't remember because presumably they weren't that significant.
Right.
Nothing much happened that week. Then there's the things we don't remember, and there might be another reason we don't remember, and those are especially interesting to explore, the memories that don't want to come out anymore, the memories we've pushed down for whatever reason.
That's going to be the title of my next memoir, Dinty. Nothing much happened that week.
That's beautiful. Irene says, Irene is someone we both know, and she says that we're both wonderful writing teachers. Thank you, Irene. Jenny wants to know if there was a particular moment, memory, or new understanding of the past that most surprised you during the writing of this particular book, Gone the Hard Road.
Yeah, well, the one I already mentioned was my father locking that door and hearing in his bluster the expression of love that couldn't be expressed any other way by this very wounded man. There are others as well. I'm trying to think of some of them right now. There's the story of my high school years, my sophomore year, which I called my lost year, where I'd taken all my savings out of the bank, all $200, I think, and it was going to run away from home. And the plan got foiled, and I was called to the principal's office, and there was my parents. And I had to give the $200 to my mother, and she sat there and counted the money. And when I revisited that in memory, I saw what a shameful moment that was for me, that my mother didn't trust that I had given her the entire money. So yeah, moments like that.
Yeah, yeah. what I find interesting, I guess this goes back again to the last question, is, the memory gaps is what I find interesting is the more you remember, the more you remember.
Right.
So I know, I'd say, I don't remember 8th grade. And then maybe this, and then I walk around for 3 days saying I don't remember 8th grade, and then something pops up.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, and then that leads to another little string along the necklace of eighth grade, and then another one. So it's in there. Those memories are in there. You have to find different ways to lure them out or pry them out. I don't know. I suppose everybody has a different way.
Sometimes
I usually have them in the shower. So I have to jump out of the shower and find a piece of paper.
sometimes you can do a timeline, like across, like of a certain period of your life, a timeline, and mark it off into major moments, and then think about that particular major moment and start listing objects or any kind of memory that you have from that particular moment. And as you say, it becomes sort of self-generative after a while. The more you remember, the more you remember.
I've ordered magazines from the 1960s on eBay just to look at the ads or to read. There'll be a little story about a movie. It's a mad world, or some Disney movie, The Love Bug, and suddenly I'm remembering, oh right, I went to that movie with my cousin Desi, and we had rubber bands and we had paper clips, and we shoot them at the screen, and all these things sort of come back. Nowadays on YouTube, you can watch TV shows from the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and there's ways to. And the TV show might not be an important part of the book you're writing or the essay you're writing, but it opens things up. It cracks the ice a little bit on memory. So there's actual techniques you can use, but really just sitting with it is probably the strongest. Have you ever ordered a magazine off eBay?
I have not, but I have watched old television shows on YouTube and old commercials on YouTube as well.
Yeah. Shiv would like to know, do we work, what she says is a question for both of us. Do you work on multiple books and or essays at the same time, or on just one?
I usually just work on one. But there are times when I'll get stuck on one and move to another, and then wait until the first one calls me back. What do you do, Dinty?
Essays, we have a lot in common, Lee. Essays, I do the same thing. I'll work on them, and then if I feel like, I've been working on this for 4 months and I'm just bored with it, which is not a good place to be as a writer, I set it aside and work on something else, and then go back 2 months later and look at that essay I was working on and go, oh wait, of course I was bored. I was looking in the wrong place.
Yeah.
I sure try to work on only one book at a time, because books are darn hard.
Yeah.
I have on occasion, because of some miracle, where more than one publisher wanted a book from me. Thank you. Worked on 2 books at once, and it was painful for myself and my family.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is really tough to work on more than one book at the same time.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question, Shiv.
Yeah. I'm going to end with this question. I think it's about teaching, from Joy. Could you speak about your students? How do you get them to understand that they do have something to say? Is it the cough drop method? How do you take a young writer of any age? How do you take a young writer of any age and convince them that they can find what they have to say?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joy. The cough drop method is pretty much kind of a nuts and bolts kind of technique that you can use, but to let a writer understand that each of us has a story to tell. I often ask the writer to think about moments in his or her or their experience that still make them uncomfortable to recall. Something, if it makes you uncomfortable, there's something unresolved there. there's something that has stayed with you through the years because you just can't quite make sense of it, or you can't quite put it to rest. And if a writer will just live inside that moment from their perspective now, without writing a word, just relive that experience, they will feel the story they have to tell. Then you can use the cough drop technique if you want to get them started putting it down on the page. But first of all, you have to feel something. And often it's these moments that still haunt us because of regret or shame or guilt or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, that moment with your mother counting the money is just so poignant.
Yeah, that was a hard one for me to remember.
Well, thank you. I apologize. There's a few questions we didn't get to, but I loved the questions we did get to, and I loved speaking with you. And I think the folks at Gramercy have some information for us. But thank you, Lee. It's a beautiful book.
Thank you so much, Dinty. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Lee and Dinty. That was wonderful. I got to remember, the more you remember, the more you remember. I'm going to think about that. I encourage the audience to tell everyone you know about Gone the Hard Road. Get a copy of it if you don't have one already. We've added a link in the chat box if you'd like to purchase a copy. We're also adding a link to Dinty's recent memoir, just came out a couple months ago, To Hell with It, of Sin and Sex, Chicken Wings, and Dante's Entirely Ridiculous Inferno. So that's in your chat box. Both of you, I can't thank you enough. This was an illuminating conversation. And just thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. I just, want to remind you also, there'll be links in the chat box with registration to 3 upcoming programs from Gramercy Books. We're open every single day, 10 to 6. We continue to provide curbside pickup, even though the pandemic seems to be moving in the right direction. Thank you again for spending part of your evening with us. And thank you again, Lee and Dinty. And we hope everyone will join us again soon and that we see you in person. Take care, everyone.